Hello, everyone. Good to see you again in our quantitative history webinar. Today, we are very happy to have Professor David Cohen from the National Taiwan University to be our speaker. Professor Cohen is now an associate professor in the Anthropology department at National Taiwan University. He is an archaeologist specializing in the Paleolithic to Neolithic transition, with many collaborative projects in North and South China, investigating hunter-gatherer adaptations from the late glacier maximum through early Holocene and the origin of agriculture. Professor Cohen is also working on a lot of other fascinating projects. For an example, the recent work on the geoarchaeology of a massive earthquake-induced outburst flood of the Yellow River and its potential relationship with China's great flood Myers and the founding of the Xia dynasty. So in the next, Professor Cohen will give 1 hour presentation, followed by the discussion by our co-organizer, Professor Yuchanyan. And finally, we will have, in the remaining time, we will have Q&A session. So for the audience, please drop your question in our Q&A box. So now, please, Professor Cohen.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to share some of my research with the University of Hong Kong Quantitative History webinar. I'd really like to thank the conveners, Professor Chun-Jer Wu and Ma Chir-Chung for inviting me, and thank you for that introduction as well. Before I get started, I'd also like to apologize. I realize this is a quantitative history webinar, and I'm an archaeologist, and I really don't do much quantitative work personally. There are archaeologists who do a lot of quantitative work. So I've been thinking about, in my presentation, what will be important to share with you. And what's important here, I think, is because more and more historians are looking towards archaeological materials. And it's important to realize how archaeologists go about constructing knowledge and our interest in human behavior and how we do this from material remains. And there can also be some biases that affect our approaches. So there's a few cautionary tales here for you, and you can think in the background how they might apply to your model building in your own fields. And also, please think about how maybe some of the questions that I put to you can be answered using quantitative methods as well. All right, so I am going to start my presentation here. Hopefully everybody can see it. This is the Yuchanyan cave site, one of 2 cave sites where I work in South China. And the stories that have been told about what people were doing in these caves have changed over the last 20 years. And this is primarily as different models are introduced and also new data are available concerning the dating of these sites, especially, and the types of material remains that are present or even not present in them. Just to get everybody oriented, the sites that I'll be looking at are Xianrendong in Jiangxi province. You can see this on the map here, and also Yuchanyan in Hunan province. And I also do work in North China on a late Paleolithic site called Shizitan, which is a completely different cultural sphere from these 2 cave sites in South China. And that's one of the things that you have to realize about late Paleolithic, early Neolithic work in China, is that we're dealing with an extensive geographical area with many, many different environments and ways that people adapted to these environments, plus the changing climate in the area and other things as well too. Okay, so just remember where these 2 cave sites are generally. And I also want to share a few terms with you because as people interested in probably later periods in human history, these might not be too familiar to you, but I'll be using them in the talk. So Pleistocene and Holocene are two geological eras. The Pleistocene begins around 2.58 million years ago and continues all the way to the technically warm period that we're in today called the Holocene, which begins 11,700 years ago or so. You'll also see that I write this abbreviation KA-CAL-BP, and what that simply means is K is kilo, so it's thousands of years ago. And I put the cal in to indicate that this is based on calibrated radiocarbon dates. I won't get into the details of that, but essentially in the period that I'm dealing with, a straight radiocarbon date will be about maybe 2,000 years too young. But looking at how radiocarbon has changed in the atmosphere over time, specialists are able to now calibrate the dates. So they look a little bit more like calendar dates to us. Okay, so the Holocene is from 11.7, and the last glacial maximum is this really, really important period when the ice in the last ice age reached its peak of development. So huge amounts of the waters of the oceans were sucked up into the glaciers, particularly in the poles of the northern hemisphere. That peak period is around 27 to 23,000 years ago, which is how it's recently been dated due to ice cores that were done in Greenland. If you look at older literature, they'll put it a little more recently than that, maybe 24 to 18,000 years ago. And of course, it varies from region to region, and the environmental effects of this big climate change will vary from region to region too. The time period that I'll be talking about today, I throw into what we can simply call the Terminal Pleistocene, which is the very last stage of the Pleistocene period, maybe from around 20,000 years ago. And I might mention the Younger Dryas as well. During the Terminal Pleistocene, climate is improving, things are getting slowly warmer and wetter, but the Younger Dryas is this sudden downturn in climate and a sudden return to kind of, in East Asia, it's generally colder and more arid conditions. What all of this looks like on a map is this. If you look, you can actually see a line representing the current borders of China, the split between the mainland and the ocean. And you can see that Taiwan is connected now at the last glacial maximum to the mainland. And if you look closely too, there's some indications of the different zones of plants, tropical zones and mixed conifer zones, etc. And you'd realize that these have all shifted from the north southward. And this is what the inhabitants of South China are dealing with, a change in the local environment, different plants and animals perhaps being available, generally colder and cooler conditions. North China itself, parts of it become uninhabitable, and that's because permafrost has developed in the northern latitudes. I work on the site Shizitan, which is almost at the boundary of where people can and can't live. I've thrown in the site of Xianrendong, also a late Paleolithic site in China, a very important one. And at LGM, people can't live there anymore. It's abandoned. And I'll show you evidence of that soon. So this is just the general environmental and chronological background for the sites. This is the landscape around Yuchanyan Cave in Daoxian in Hunan province. It's a karstic landscape. And if you look closely in that cone on the right side, you can see the cave itself. And how I'm starting this talk, I want to talk about what I'm just calling the old story. It's what was told about these caves and how people lived in them when they were first excavated. And as work continued on them in the 1990s and early 2000s. This was based on models that were being used at the time and the types of evidence that were available. But both these sites, Xianrendong and Yuchanyan, at the time were thought to date between 15 to 10,000 years ago. And they were very important because at both of these sites, there were discoveries of early pottery vessels and rice remains. And the old story was about these sites being sites of the early Neolithic. They represented a gap in the archaeological record for when the Neolithic started, this revolutionary change in how humans live their lives, and also being sites that gave evidence about the beginnings of the story about how rice was cultivated too. This is a picture from our team's collaborative excavations in 2005, but I wanted to introduce to you first Professor Xianrendong, who was the director of the Yuchanyan excavations, first in the 1990s when excavations started, and also in the 2000s when he invited Ofer Bar Yosef from Harvard University and an international team to come work with him to help resolve some unanswered questions about the cave, to apply very recent archaeological methods, and particularly types of dating methods combined with micromorphology, which I'll introduce to you in a minute, with other multidisciplinary techniques. Xianrendong is an amazing scholar, and as I've mentioned, he is one of these people who has been very, very open to bringing in new ideas, to doing collaborative work, and most importantly, to sharing the data that he has from his sites. This isn't a common enough thing in archaeology, but I've discovered the best archaeologists in the world are the ones who are the most willing to share the data from their sites, and Xianrendong is one of these elite archaeologists. Okay. So what I'm saying here isn't by making him a sort of a representative of the old story, isn't to put him down at all. I'm just merely illustrating what the kind of the state of the art was at this time period, and we can look a little bit about the reasons for why people interpreted the archaeological record in a certain way, and why those ideas have changed. So he wrote 2 papers, one in Chinese, and it was translated into English. But the story about these sites that was emphasized was the discovery of rice remains in the caves. So he wrote the most important discovery at Yuchanyan is the finding of rice husks. And Professor Zhang Wenxu, a professor who specializes in the study of plant remains, was also brought to the site to work on the rice remains. And the rice remains that were found at Yuchanyan, he characterized as having combined characteristics of wild rice and the 2 domesticated types of rice present today, indica and japonica rice. But he saw these as the most primitive type of ancient cultivated rice types in the initial evolution toward domestication. Therefore, we call this Yuchanyan ancient cultivated rice. So the emphasis on rice remains, seeing the rice as cultivated, and also seeing this as the beginnings of a long-term process were key aspects of how these sites were seen as being important in this time period. Xianrendong went further to connect these sites to the Neolithic Revolution or the agricultural revolution, seeing them and Yuchanyan as the early stage of this tremendous change in human prehistory, where people who had been mobile became sedentary, agriculturalists, growing their own food. So that's the story that was told about Yuchanyan. These are the rice remains. I should indicate here that you can count the number of rice grains that were actually excavated in the cave and found in the cave on one of your hands. There were 4 or 5 rice grains only. So that's a problem in itself, and we'll get back to that, just how reliable or not these remains are. But I also wanted to just give you a peek at some work by Professor Zhang Wenshu because it's absolutely amazing too, and he was a great guy to work with. He also wrote a diary of his time working in the cave at Yuchanyan, which is available. But in addition to being a paleobotanist, he was also a poet, artist, calligrapher, painter too. And the bottom picture is from a book he wrote on it's landscape paintings and poems and his calligraphy, but it's all based on the scientific imagery he had, scanning electron microscope photos and such of the rice remains from Yuchanyan. Just really incredible stuff. Okay, so the second aspect of the old story is the pottery remains. And these were, of course, recognized as important too. The issue was how early they dated. And as I mentioned, seeing them as 10 to 15,000 years ago was based on some biases. I'll get to those in a second. But when these sites were excavated, they were immediately seen as early Neolithic because of the pottery and the rice remains, of course, too. Pottery was, in this model, a marker of the Neolithic. Where there was pottery, there had to be the Neolithic. Where there's the Neolithic, there has to be cultivated plant remains. And so they fit that view of things. They were shaped to fit that view of things. It fit well with discoveries of settled villages that had been excavated in the 1970s and 80s in the middle Yangtze from Pengtoshan and in the lower Yangtze region from Hemudu. So Yuchanyan and Xianrendong could really fill the gap. And when those sites were excavated, they were called Middle Neolithic, expecting something earlier to eventually appear. And so these two cave sites, Yuchanyan and Xianrendong, were given the label of early Neolithic. The pottery that was found at Xianrendong in Jiangxi and a neighboring site too, Diaotonghuan, was excavated in the 1990s by the same international collaborative team. At the time was thought to date between 15 and 10,000 years ago. They had many, many radiocarbon dates, and Scotty McNeish, who was the American collaborator and a very, very famous archaeology in American studies of agricultural origins. He did his original work in the 1960s in Mexico. That's why he was invited to China by Professor Yan Wenming of Peking University in order to apply American styles of excavation and analyses to the Xianrendong archaeological record and try to get a grasp on the sequence of development of rice agricultural production. But McNeish actually rejected dates that were earlier than 15,000 that were already available from their samples. And he did this, it seems, primarily because he was expecting Jomon pottery, which was only dated back to around 12,000 years ago at that point, should be older than the Chinese pottery. So it was this bias based on just his own views of what the relationships should be between different geographical areas and the early pottery. Okay, so we can ask ourselves, why were the sites labeled as early Neolithic? And there's many papers, but this is just one example of how these sites were dated as early Neolithic. It's a paper by Cui Jianxin and Zhou Shangzhe on the forces of cultural evolution in the Chinese Neolithic period. So the bottom part of the image shows us how the early Neolithic is represented by both Xianrendong and Yuchanyan caves, and you can see the dates for them too. Now, behind a lot of this is what's now a fundamental model in archaeology of cultural evolution. And the first big thinker who's had a tremendous impact on archaeological thought was V. Gordon Childe. And his notion of the Neolithic revolution, this is a term now that's just generally used in archaeology as if it's always existed. And Childe is almost often neglected to be cited when it is used, but it's originally his term. And he was the first archaeologist who was really calling for the development of evolutionary models and systemic understanding of long-term cultural processes. Now, every archaeologist thinks this way, but Childe was the one who really pushed this and began it. And Childe had a bunch of traits that he associated with the Neolithic and the systematic way in which society was changing during the Neolithic. But some of the traits include pottery and, of course, ground stone tools. That's why it's called Neolithic, the new Stone Age. Village life, which means people living in sedentary villages and houses that they built, which people had never done before the Neolithic. And they're growing domesticated plants, and they have the husbandry of domesticated animals too. In more recent years, these things are kind of recognized as a Neolithic package. This is a term you might see. What's happening in the early interpretations of Xianrendong and Yuchanyan is that the elements of the package are present. So we can identify these sites as Neolithic because they have rice remains, they have pottery. The issue here was Childe's model was based on data from a different area. It was based on what was known in the 1930s, 20s from Southwest Asia and Europe. So the question is, how universal are archaeological models? And we should always be asking that, and actually asking it across fields of the social sciences as well. So Ofer Bar Yosef, who was the main collaborator in the Yuchanyan and Xianrendong projects, and my teacher in graduate school and my longtime collaborator in China, he sadly passed away in 2020, but he was an amazing man, an amazing, highly regarded archaeologist too, and his ideas have just had a tremendous impact on the field. And he started in Southwest Asia, but he got interested in China early on. And in one of his synthetic papers on the Chinese Paleolithic, he warns us against the biases of seeing the European and Southwest Asian cases as the norm. And actually, the European conceptual frameworks and terminology have tremendously influenced Chinese archaeology, but often in a negative way. And one of the key problems is that in trying to fit things into European outside frameworks, the archaeological record in China becomes distorted. And we fail to really appreciate the significance of many of the East Asian materials, especially the pottery in these cave sites. So that's what I'm going to look at for the rest of the talk, the news story. And the news story for Xianrendong and Yuchanyan is this. These caves, they're not caves of the early Neolithic. They're not caves that give us information about the cultivation of rice. There just wasn't enough rice remains at these sites, and their contexts aren't very clear at all. But the early pottery is there, and we now know these to be hunter-gatherer contexts. These are Upper Paleolithic mobile small bands of people who are coming to these caves seasonally, but they're also producing the earliest pottery in the world. This is amazing because it doesn't fit the outside models at all. So why were hunters and gatherers in East Asia making pottery at this early time period? 20,000 years ago is what we found the dates for Xianrendong should be, and Yuchanyan around 18,000, the world's earliest pottery. This slide is just describing what hunter-gatherers are. I won't dwell on it, but you can scan it quickly. But the main points to make is that these are small bands of people. They're not living in one spot throughout the year or even for a major part of the year. They don't store food typically. Of course, there's a range of behaviors that can be included. And they typically migrate around a certain range of sites seasonally. And we argue that we can find evidence at these cave sites to support them being people inhabited occasionally, seasonally, and ephemerally. That means not for long periods of time, and maybe not even every year. We actually find gaps in the record. So we can argue that these are caves of mobile hunter-gatherer groups who are coming to these caves seasonally. Another concept that Ofer came up with is this notion of the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. And the caves in South China are an interesting case to apply this notion to. And I'll show you why in a second. But it has to do with the very conservative nature of the stone tools at these sites. So Ofer, you can see he's borrowing from Child, the urban revolution, the Neolithic revolution. He's pushing it back. And what he's saying is that there are these fundamental changes in human behavior that occur during the Upper Paleolithic. This is first based on Southwest Asia and Europe too, and Africa as well, where the cases are known better. But we can also apply this way of thinking in this framework in China as well. But we also have to realize that we need to look for it in different ways. And other archaeologists also have talked about this in using the term behavioral modernity. And the issue here is that modern humans evolved maybe 200,000 years ago or more. But although there's anatomical evolution early on, not until maybe 40 or 50,000 years ago, and it varies from areas and there's exceptions too, but there's this key change in behavior that occurs. And trying to understand why this change happens is one of these major questions in archaeology. For us, we can think about it in terms of what we see in the well-known Upper Paleolithic of Europe. And if you think of things like cave paintings appearing, or you can see the individual here wearing necklaces and carving figurines, having ornaments on the body of the dead. These are all about new types of activities, specializations that are going on, complex forms of symbolism and nonverbal communication. And behind this too could be sweeping linguistic changes, the development of complex languages, and they all lead to larger, more integrated populations, so greater social exchange networks and things like that. We're archaeologists though, and when you're dealing with sites that are 40, 50,000 years old or 20,000 years old, there's the issue of preservation. So the fantastic things that are clear markers of these types of new symbolic activities and such are often not preserved so well. What we often see at sites are stone tools. And for Europe, Southwest Africa, Southwest Asia and Africa, blades, the long stone tools you can see in the upper right, are key markers of the Upper Paleolithic. But we have a big problem in China in that there's very, very little blade production. There's maybe a few sites in North China and absolutely none in South China that have blades. We don't have the typical markers of behavioral modernity and the Upper Paleolithic in China. So it's hard to apply these models. The cultural developments are different. The timing is different too. Here's just what North China looks like. This is Xianrendong, the site that I pointed out on the map at the beginning. So the very bottom row there shows blade production, which is exceptional. There aren't other sites in North China that really have blade production like this. It's 41,000 years ago, and it's seen as intrusive, meaning it's not like previous industries in China, and it doesn't continue at Xianrendong after 41,000. Around 33,000, it's replaced by what looks more like the usual Chinese Paleolithic industry, a cornflake industry. We also actually don't know what species produced the Xianrendong blades. At this time period, you might not realize it, but in addition to modern humans in China, there's also evidence of Neanderthals and Denisovans and maybe even Homo longi, a species that was just classified and identified a few months ago, and other archaic humans being around the area and who could have been the producers of these blades too. The other thing I want to point out is, if you see towards the top, there's a gap. There's no cultural record at Xianrendong, meaning there's no radiocarbon dates from any site in this time period, 27 to 10.5 thousand years ago. And that's because it's the last glacial maximum. It was too cold and dry to live in that area anymore. And people who were there were pushed to the south. And this creates pressures in the south, perhaps, too. And by the south, I mean North China. During this gap, the site of Shirzatan and a few other sites start to have a technological innovation called microblades, which we see as an adaptation to the conditions of the last glacial maximum. It's a subject of another talk. But these groups from North China who develop microblades, when things get a little warmer, they're migrating. So they migrate back into the Xianrendong area, and they also migrate all the way up into Northeast Asia and across to Alaska and into the New World. This is also the story of the populating of the New World too. Okay, so let's get back to South China during this time period, though. So remember the blade industries and the microblades in South China, and during the Upper Paleolithic, the stone tools look like this. These are choppers. They're a core, and you strike it a few times, and you can remove a series of flakes from one edge. And the flakes can be used as tools too. This is a technology that could be over 3 million years old, but it's being used in the late Paleolithic, the Upper Paleolithic in South China by the same people who are making the first pottery in the world, though, too. But archaeological interpretation in the past of these caves is based on how the stone tools are looked at. And the Yuchanyan, Xianrendong, and other sites from this time period in the south, and this area actually extends into Southeast Asia as well. The Huabinian in Southeast Asia is related to these groups too. The stone tools, the lithics, are seen as conservative or even backwards, following outside models. So we have this issue in South China. How should we be looking at these stone tools? Is there new ways of looking at them so that we can see in them the behavioral modernity that is there by the people who produced the first pottery too? So can chopping tools be modern? I won't get into it today, but we're starting looking at these tools in new ways now that allow us to identify it's old technology, but perhaps new things are going on with them. The other thing is that there has to be a realization that stone tools might not be telling the whole story as well. And perhaps these simple stone tools can be used to produce other tools that are more complex and have more specific types of functions. And this relates to what's been called the bamboo tool hypothesis, or just simply using these choppers and flakes to make more complex tools out of organic materials that don't preserve. And this has long been an idea, but it had never been tested. So part of our work was actually developing some ways of making the stone tools ourselves and working on bamboo to seeing just what was possible. And we actually discovered that, first of all, the lithic raw material in Hunan in South China, you can make very, very complex types of stone tools with it if you wanted. If there's archaeologists listening out there, le Valois can be produced on this material. So the old argument that, well, the raw material is limiting people is not the case at all. This is a cultural reason. It might have to do with the traditions in the area and just what was conceivable in terms of lithic technology, or there might be other reasons behind it, but it's not the raw materials. And we also found that simple tools, choppers, flakes, could make a blade out of bamboo. If you're interested in looking at this more, you can read our paper here on this. And if you search YouTube, Metin Aaron actually has a video of him making the stone tools and working bamboo to make a bamboo blade. Okay, so this is a simple equation that lithic simplicity does not equal cognitive simplicity. It's an oversimplified equation, but this gets to one of the issues that we face in the South, that the traditional models for how we see cognitive evolution, the development of behavior, simply can't be used because the lithics, the part of the archaeological record that preserves well in South China, stays pretty constant. It's very, very unusual, actually. Archaeologists are used to things developing. And in South China, the lithics, they don't develop in this period. So we have to look at other things too. As a slight side note too, Southeast Asia has now, it's been recognized, has the world's earliest figurative art. And I should mention that it's in caves. This is in Sulawesi, dating over 45,000 years ago. And there's another one in Borneo, dating over 40,000 years ago. So this area of the world, you know, they're leaders in certain things, just not in the complexity of lithic production. So let's not forget this. And also let's think about the use of caves too. And I'll return to that point slightly later as well. Okay, so if we put things on the map, this is the so-called chopping tool or pebble tool tradition in South China that Yuchanyan and Xianrendong belong to, as do Huabinian sites. And in North, there's a very distinct separate cultural sphere of groups that are producing microblades beginning from 26 or 27,000 years ago. Just to contrast the two lithic industries to each other quickly, microblade production is showing here, and the different types of tools that are in these assemblages in North China, while South China things look like this. It's night and day, really. The other thing to realize is that we can look at the same map and we can plot when the earliest pottery appears in each region too. So where the chopping tool tradition is, we have the earliest pottery in the world at these cave sites in South China, beginning 20,000 years ago. Zhoumong early pottery sites date from 16,000 years ago, slightly after that. By 15,000 years ago, we have early pottery appearing amongst hunter-gatherers in the Russian Far East. And by 13 to 11,000 years ago in Northeast China, and North China by 12 to 10,000 years ago. It's another topic of discussion, but what is the relationship between these groups? Is pottery being developed independently, or is this have to do with greater exchanges of ideas across many, many networks of people and over long areas? My own thinking is that they could very likely be related to each other, but we won't look into that further today, at least. But what we will look at is some of the details of these sites. So first, let's turn our attention to Xianrendong in Jiangxi. And the news story about Xianrendong, as I mentioned, is that it's a site of early pottery. And I put this in quotes because this is a term now that we're introducing into the literature. So replacing early Neolithic, these sites are not early Neolithic, and they're not typical of the late Paleolithic anywhere else in the world. So we tend to call them now early pottery sites. And we're emphasizing that this is pottery made by mobile hunter-gatherers who are likely in these caves seasonally. This occurs before the Neolithic anywhere in the world. It occurs before there's any evidence of sedentism and there's any evidence of managing plants or cultivating plants, cultivating rice. Xianrendong was first excavated in the 1960s. And then in the 1990s, when Professor Yan Wenming, who was the PI, invited Scotty McNeish to the site, as I mentioned before. During the 1990s, there were still disputes over the dating and the nature of the sequence. And when the site, they were thinking of nominating the site as a World Heritage Site in the early 2000s. So our team was invited through Professor Wu Xiaohong, a radiocarbon specialist at Peking University, who's an important member of our team, to go for a week or two to Xianrendong and to collect systematic radiocarbon samples and micromorphological samples and to really figure out what the dating of the earliest pottery of this site was. And to our surprise at the time, the site dated much earlier than had previously been expected. We were able to securely date the site through systematic radiocarbon dating and checking how secure the radiocarbon dates samples were through micromorphology. We were able to date it to 20,000 years ago, which makes it the earliest pottery in the world. This is a plan of the opening of Xianrendong Cave, and the big squares are where the 1960s excavations were done. The smaller squares are where the 1990s excavations were done. But actually the collaborative excavations in the 1990s, they were only allowed to excavate the first 20 centimeters of the 1 meter squares. And we went in 2009 and we exposed the profiles of the 1990s excavations so we could acquire small samples from those profiles. So this is our work in 2009. And the idea was we needed to gain a better understanding of the dates of the caves and how the deposits were formed, and also what human activities were going on in these caves. So we do this through systematic radiocarbon dating, as I mentioned, and what's called geoarchaeological soil micromorphology. And the key developer of that technique is sitting in front of us here. It's Professor Paul Goldberg. He's retired now, but he was, when I was at BU too, he was a colleague of mine there. And he's really the person that developed this incredibly powerful tool methodology in archaeology today. Our dating shows that the site was not just occupied over a range of dates, but we can actually, because we have so many radiocarbon dates, they can become proxies for when people were at the cave and when they were not at the cave, when there's gaps in the record. And this is because if you think about it, most radiocarbon dates are the results of people doing stuff. They're burning things, they're bringing stuff into the cave. So when there's samples and dates present, it means people had to be there to produce the samples. And when there's gaps in the dating record, it means maybe people weren't at the cave at the time, so there's no samples. So that's how they're proxies. So we see that people began occupying the cave around 25,000 years ago, but at 16,000, there's a gap till 12,000 years ago. And the first pottery was made around 20,000 years ago. At Xianrendong, there's been discussions about rice being present at the site. Looking more closely at these records, they tend to come from phytolith evidence. It's microscopic silica bodies within the cells of plants. So after the plant rots away, the phytoliths can still be preserved at archaeological sites, but they're examined microscopically. And these may indicate that rice was exploited at the end of the Xianrendong phase, occupation, maybe 12,000 years ago. It's not clear if these were wild or cultivated, perhaps wild. But it's still an interesting part of the story of the eventual cultivation and domestication of rice. But it's not the key aspect of why this cave is important. So here's our team working at the cave, Paul Goldberg and me in the front, Ofer Bar Yosef, Wu Xiaohong, and Zhang Che, a Neolithic archaeology specialist at Peking University, and Hong Xiaochun, who's written a lot of papers on the East Asian and Southeast Asian Neolithic, was visiting the site too, so she's in this picture as well in the back row. So this is the west section from the cave where we reopen the old profile. And I'm drawing a line here. And the red line that's going across is where pottery is found above this line, and no pottery is found below it during the excavations. And this is our radiocarbon dates that we published in Science in 2012. If you look closely, you can see that all of the dates in the layers above and below the red line fit in really nicely for us to argue that the dates of the pottery are after 20,000 years ago and before 19,000 years ago. And this is all based on 45 samples that were dated at this cave. That's an incredible amount. And this is what I mean by systematic. And we don't just do this in one section, we do it in two. So this is the east section where we do the same thing. Above this line is where pottery appears, and the dates are pretty much the same as in the west section too. Okay, so with so many dates, this is how we're able to identify when people weren't in the cave as well with the gaps. We can be fairly certain that the pottery also dates within the range that these layers date to. If you just have 1, 2, 3, 7 dates, you wouldn't be able to do this as securely. The other arguments that are often made with radiocarbon date is that, well, what is the relationship between the sample that you date, the piece of burnt bone or plant remains, burnt plant remains, something like that, and the actual event or object that you're trying to date? That's the association. And a problem that can exist is that caves are very complex stratigraphically, and any site can have disturbances. So the radiocarbon sample can get mixed up, and you get the wrong relationship between it and what you want to date. But we have our tool of micromorphology. And micromorphology, I'll show you this in a second, but we can look at the layers of the site under a microscope. And we can see the exact processes by which this layer formed, and if it was transformed, changed, disturbed at all during its complete formation and depositional history. And we see that the sediments at Xianrendong and at Yuchanyan too, they've been relatively stable, that the samples of the size we use, 1 centimeter or greater of bone, would not have shifted around in the archaeological record at these sites. So we feel confident in our dating results. You're also wondering what the early pottery looks like. These are some of the sherds from Xianrendong, from the east area. This early pottery was made by slab construction. Some of it's also made by coiling and paddling. The outside of the sherd and sometimes the interior might have some markings on it. Some might be cord marked, some might be plain surface, and some have what are these striations on the surface, like you can see in the bottom one here. Maybe bundles of some sort of plant material were scraped across the surface of the vessel. The reconstructed vessel here is from the 1962 excavations, and it probably represents a very late period of the site, but the other sherds are early pottery sherds from the the west and the east area too. Other cultural materials include unio shell, freshwater shell, large pieces of shell that were probably, they have the two holes in them, so they were probably some sort of cutter or knife or something like that. Late period had grinding stones for processing materials. It hasn't been done here, but other sites we look at the microscopically at the starches and phytolith remains on grinding stones, so we can see what they're used to grind. And often it's a full range of plant materials as well as sometimes minerals like hematite, ochre. And very importantly, these cave sites, I mentioned the lithics are conservative and simple, but these cave sites have polished bone tool industries. And not much work has been done on these before, but if you're looking for something that changes through time at these late Paleolithic sites, it's probably the bone tools that do it, and they deserve much more study. And here is snack time at Xianrendong. And I'm showing this to illustrate the point that we enjoy the food at these sites and the way our hosts treat us. But also, this shows us the importance of these sites locally too. As I mentioned, the site, they were thinking of nominating it for World Heritage status, and and since then it's become part of a kind of a ceramic heritage trail, because the Jingdezhen kiln is not too far away from Xianrendong too, so they can be fit into the same tourist circuit. So it was really the interest of the Jiangxi provincial government and the various strata of the local government too, who were interested in having us come and helping resolve a lot of the issues at the site. And on our last day of working, when we're packing everything up and shipping our samples off, we were at the post office. We were supposed to get back to the site because the deputy governor of the province was coming to visit and see our progress on the site. And we were a little bit delayed at the post office, and the local officials were getting very nervous. So they actually sent a police van to the post office to pick us up. And they took us back to the site with the sirens going and the lights flashing. And we had to be certain to get there before the deputy governor got there. And we got there safely. Okay, so I mentioned micromorphology. What is soil micromorphology? Like I said, it's looking at the site's deposits under the microscope. And the reason for this is a key thought, is that the site sediments are actually a cultural record. Before, they were really just seen as, this is kind of the dirt that the objects are buried in. And it's not just that. The sediments themselves tell us so much about the history of the site. And we can divide this into the natural elements of its history, which are the geogenic processes, and the human activities that also contribute to the deposits. So we can see types of human behavior that can't be seen in the objects in the record. So these are called anthropogenic. And this is what builds up the site over time. And then once things are in the ground, these also get changed through various chemical and physical processes, plus bioturbation, which is animals and plants and other things disturbing the sediments. I won't get into the details of that, but micromorphology looks at the materials, sees all of this, but its goal is to find how the site was built up through time, the natural processes, and also find evidence of different types of human behavior at the sites. And this has fundamentally changed our view about what's going on in these caves. I'm just going to go through this quickly. The west area of the site we found was just built up by flooding. So there's a small stream outside of the cave, and it floods and brings in materials over the years they built up. The east area of the site is a little bit more interesting because the bottom part of it was built up through flooding, but it reached the stage where it was above the floods. And so the record is built up with some inputs from people. And these people were dumping stuff in the cave. They were dumping bone and ash and charcoal that was from activities that were done elsewhere. So one of the surprising finds in the micromorphology is that we have all of these excavations in the cave, but the actual real activities of people at Xianrendong were probably going on somewhere else, somewhere outside the cave. From the limited area where we looked, people were using the cave. They were tossing their garbage into the cave. So if you're working on a cave site, the short end of this is to look on the outside on the terrace. Okay. So that's micromorphology at Xianrendong. Now we go to Yuchanyan, which I mentioned before our collaborative team worked on in 2004, 2005. I joined it in 2005. And I just wanted to highlight some of the work we did there. I see I have maybe 3 or 4 minutes left. So first of all, the project is multidisciplinary. There was work done on the plant remains. This is flotation to recover more rice. But in spite of all the work done on the 4 or 5 rice grains found, it's really probably a dead end in the study. These are things, the context isn't clear. The real story is hunters and gatherers making pottery. And this is when the first pot was found in situ in 1995. And the 2005 excavations found 2 sherds. So in total, there was a reconstructible vessel that looked like this, which is just incredible, an 18,000-year-old pottery vessel. There was a big fragment of a second vessel that hasn't been published yet, and then a few sherds. And the question we really want to ask is what this pottery was used for. No analyses have been done on the early pottery in China, but there have been studies done in Japan if people are interested in finding out more. And this looks at residues in the pottery. It can be from fatty acids and lipids. It can also be from plant remains. For Jomon pottery, at one site they find it's mainly being used to process marine animals. Another site was for plant remains. So it of course will vary. But the technique itself is really, really incredible that we can find these things microscopically. The important questions to ask is, why are hunters and gatherers producing pottery at these sites? And what are the functions? So the typical things that we need to answer first are its economic and subsistence roles: cooking, storage, salting, grease extraction. And then we can also think about its social roles, because there's arguments about feasting being important too. This is Yuchanyan cave excavations going on. And Mary Prendergast is in the front there. I'm a bit behind her. I'm showing her because she did a very important zooarchaeological study on the bones, a taphonomical study that I'll get to in a second. Here's some of the stone tools being excavated. The bone tools at Yuchanyan too haven't been looked at in a systematic way, but could be very revealing. The typical approach to looking at the animal remains that are found in the site has been to construct a species list, which is very important, identifying which species are there, and from them understanding the environment, and possibly when people were there, especially if there's migratory birds, which is the case at Yuchanyan. That's why we think hunters and gatherers were at the site during the winter and spring. But zooarchaeologically, there's other approaches that can be applied. And this is often a quantification approach too. We're looking at taphonomy. What elements of the animals are at the site? How were they processed? Why were people bringing these specific parts of the animal to the site, and what were they doing with them? Are some of the types of questions that can be asked with this approach. And Mary makes the argument that what we're seeing at Yuchanyan is actually resource intensification, where there's this switch, and it's a new type of behavior where people at the cave are focusing. They have specialized hunting of deer. And it's not just any deer. They're actually picking the prime individuals, the largest animals, the mature, strongest animals are the ones that are being hunted, and parts of the animals are being brought to the cave, and they're processing these animals as much as they possibly can to get as much nutrition out of them. So they're smashing apart bones for marrow, and they're probably boiling the soft, spongy parts of the bones to extract grease from them. And if you think about it, maybe the pottery relates to that, but we have no idea yet. It's a good hypothesis, right? Okay, so this is just about how marrow-rich bones, you need to fragment them to get the marrow out. So this would show in the archaeological record. And to get grease out in boiling bones, it actually destroys the bone. They probably won't be preserved well. So you'll have a low survivorship of these types of bones too. But you'll also see very high fragmentation rates. Okay, so this is sort of the expectations of what's going on, and then you have to look at the animal bones themselves in special ways, identify types of breakage, what bones are there, what animals they belong to, and do all sorts of detailed studies that way. And then you compare them to ethnographic examples. So Mary was comparing how the bones were broken up and used at Yuchanyan to what has been observed at hunter-gatherer camps in Africa, and also to archaeological sites of the Natufian. And they actually share a lot of similarities to these ethnographic and Natufian examples too. And that's why she makes the argument for resource intensification going on. So these are the parts of the animals that survived at the sites, and which types of animals, deer versus small fauna. And then I mentioned which animals were selected amongst deer. And you can do this by looking at age profiles. And this involves looking at the bones in certain ways to understand how old or young the animals were when they died. And you look at, are these prime age individuals or juveniles or old individuals? And the Yuchanyan samples fit the prime age dominated corner. So this is one of my limited examples of how quantification must be used, but can be very revealing looking at the faunal data set too. And of course, there's many, many other approaches. The radiocarbon dating at Yuchanyan we did before Xianrendong, but it follows the similar pattern where we combine it with micromorphology. And because there's so many dates, we can see gaps in the record. So this would be periods when people weren't using the cave. And the pink area here is when the earliest pottery dates to. And that's why we can put it in that range of around 18,000 years ago or so. And if we want to plot across East Asia, we can see the sites in red are South China sites with early pottery, and green are Japanese Jomon sites, the Russian Far East sites. So you can see how everything fits in. And in recent years, there's been some confirmation that there's other sites out there as well that have these early dates. This was just reported in 2019 in Kaogu. It's a site in Guangdong called Qingtang, and it has pottery dating to 17,000 years ago. Qihedong in Fujian has maybe 13,000-year-old or so pottery, and there'll be others appearing too, I hope. The Qingtang site also has an early burial. So these are practices, again, that we can relate to behavioral modernity too. Another of the most famous Upper Paleolithic or Late Paleolithic burial sites in China is, of course, Zhoukoudian Upper Cave. And lastly, for Yuchanyan is the cave sediments and the micromorphology. And we had this amazing discovery at Yuchanyan to see that these are the deposits, and you can see the red and gray. Actually, all of the deposits at Yuchanyan are made up of burning wood. It's all remains from ashes. And this we identify micromorphologically, but also biomineralogically too. We can see the phytoliths as well. Plus, the red bands, people were bringing red clay into the site. and they were building these surfaces near their hearths. And this is a new type of behavior too. So we have very, very intensive pyrotechnology going on, something new. And this might connect with making pottery. They were also shaping clay into surfaces that maybe they used to dry seeds or something like that, parching. Again, you could perhaps build connections to making pottery too. But these are all forms of new behavior at these sites. Tied to behavioral modernity, we can also look at the heating temperature of the bones using FTIR and see that they weren't heated above 400. It's tough to draw conclusions from that if they were being boiled or something else, just because of the way meat can be cooked. But Yuchanyan deposits are completely human formed. They're anthropogenic from repeated episodes of burning wood. And this is a new intensive form of modern behavior at these caves that's going along with the production of pottery. And despite having a 3 million year old type of lithic technology, and it's shared with other areas too. So if you're interested in that, there's this paper that was published in, this one's in geoarchaeology. Okay, so just to conclude, some things to think about as we continue the story. First is that after Yuchanyan and Xianrendong and these other sites, there's a gap still between early pottery sites and the real early Neolithic sites, which are in different areas. They're no longer in these hilly regions. They're on the river floodplains, such as Pengtoshan sites and Shangshan culture sites in the lower Yangtze River. And Pengtoshan's in the middle. Also, we need to think more about what the functions and roles of the early pottery are, and how do we figure this out. We really need to reevaluate models of hunter-gatherer mobility and behavior in East Asia, and look more at the different types of data that we can apply to this issue. Also, this is something I want to get into more myself, because I've been working on, for example, cave sites in the Philippines that are burial sites and very tied into cosmology and religious practices. But the Chinese caves are always looked at in economic terms. So I'm beginning to think, can we gain different understandings of these caves by starting to think about possible connections to cosmology and worldview? And caves worldwide are often thought of as liminal spaces, and sometimes even dangerous spaces, used for burials, used for cave art, and things like that. And we have examples of these now in this general region of cave art in Sulawesi and Borneo, and burials at Qingtang and things like that. So perhaps we can look at these caves through new perspectives as well, and get at more insight into how people were thinking and behaving in this time period. So that's my time for today. I'd like to thank everybody for their joining us in this talk, and also thanks to my colleagues in China and funders too at Harvard, institutes in China that we work with, and through recent grant funding through the Taiwan Ministry of Science and Technology. I mentioned some papers in the text, the ones that I didn't fully cite. This is a list of them in case people need more information. And I'll just leave the slide here for a couple seconds. But that's it for my talk today. Again, thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Cohen. Now let's turn to the discussion part. Let's welcome Professor Chen from Hong Kong University to discuss for about 10 to 15 minutes. Professor Chen.
Thank you, Zhichen. Also, thank you, Professor Cohen. So this is a wonderful overview of your recent research, as well as the general archaeology, as well as Chinese archaeology literature. It's always a good learning experience for me. But I have to declare that my specialty is not in archaeology. So I cannot make too many or any sophisticated comments, but more have what I'm going to say are really questions about out of my own mind. So I think at the beginning, David, you introduced the golden child model. I thought actually this is a very good thing for me to link that with what I typically sort of walk away with from archaeology museums in China, because oftentimes they don't make a distinction in terms of what would be the minimum set of elements that has to be satisfied in order to say that sedentary agriculture or Neolithic revolution already started there. So if I can summarize again, I will mention for everyone again, the basic elements in the golden child model include pottery, village life, and domesticated plants, domesticated animals, and various stone tools. So I think this is a very good list that serves as a good yardstick to especially date when the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic was really completed. Based on this, I do have one question. Is there like a size filter or size criterion, for example, for the pottery? When a pottery, when a pot or a device for holding water or liquid, when it is big enough, then I guess it goes from simple, easy to carry pottery from one location to another to a storage device, a container. I guess for hunter-gatherers, they could not really have big containers or carry big containers from one place to another. But for small pottery pieces, should not be a problem. I guess even for a horse rider to carry a few cups in the pockets or somewhere in the back of the horse, it will still be very much doable. So that's why maybe for hunter-gatherers, as long as the pottery pieces are not too big, then there's no contradiction or no difficulty the pottery would present to live in a hunter-gatherer life. So I wonder whether among your colleagues there's some general consensus that this pottery piece has to be this small, otherwise it would cross to the other side of a sedentary lifestyle that would be needed in order to be able to allow the locals really to make use on a continuous basis of big containers. Because I often say to my friends, for many years I got very puzzled when I visited the Metropolitan Museum and other places where they would always display so many pottery pieces and container pieces. I thought, why are they always focused on displaying such big containers? Later I realized it's a big revolutionary jump to go from small pieces. Okay, so that's my first question. The second question is about the choppers. Because before we started this webinar, when we were chatting, I was mentioning that archaeological experts can just show us and tell us what they have found in terms of the material remains. then we can help do some quantification of the seemingly unquantifiable things. I mean, in terms of the chopper, let's say, it's very nice to see that you have shown us a progression of different stones from very rough, big, coarse stone tools to increasingly smaller and finer and sharper tools, and then even eventually the bone tools. But I guess just like in finance, we can decompose very complicated financial instruments or securities into atomic tools, or what we call digital securities. So every complicated financial security can be decomposed into a portfolio of single-purpose digital securities. And then I also learned that, like among engineers of voice, because several years ago I did some online course, and then the voice engineer working for the companies told me, "Oh, you just pronounce a lot of different words and sentences, and will help extract the basic elements that make up your voice, so that we can actually re-engineer whatever pronunciation of any Chinese character, maybe with a Hunanese accent. That's okay." So they just get the basic set of elements that are pieces of whatever I say or however I sound. So I guess for chopper tools, one could decompose a perfect late Neolithic chopper tool into different attributes or basic attributes, and then use some scaling of each attribute and apply it to a given chopper you'd find in Xianrendong or the Yuchanyan. My favorite place is always Hunan. So whenever you go there for discovery efforts, I guess next time we'll get our Hunan governor to receive you, instead of just sending a vice governor. Hunan will send the #1 governor, or maybe even the party secretary, to receive you. So I guess you can use some quantification method by first decomposing each chopper or good chopper into different pieces, and then use some quantified measure to reflect or capture the progression, so that you can say, well, at this time, when this metric has reached this value, then it switched from a Paleolithic way of life to the Neolithic way of life, at least as far as the stone tool technology is concerned. So I don't know whether that has been practiced in the field to actually move in this direction. So that so I don't know, because it's always amazing to me how archaeologists can actually use human eyes to tell that this piece is so much better and probably was modeled or based on another piece from a totally different away archaeological site. There may be a more systematic, quantitative way to go about that. And then lastly, I actually, it's very interesting that your advisor brought up this difference possibly in between China, Southeast Asia, and then Europe. Because if we use modern things, it's always amazing. The Chinese people use chopsticks, right? And then the Europeans use silverware. So I guess that's a good contrasting example that illustrates for archaeological discovery work, the kind of tools that would mark a lot of revolutionary progress in this part of the world probably differs from what it would take for Africans or Europeans, because to begin with, the lifestyles were different across the different continents and so on. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, David.
It's interesting because the chopsticks analogy was actually a favorite that Ofer would use in discussions too, to talk about the differences between one area of the world and another, or one region and another. And I'm not sure if he ever wrote it in any of his papers or not. He might have. I can't recall offhand, but he certainly used it a lot as an analogy. But what it has to do with, in that any type of material remains that people produce, that we find at an archaeological site, are part of a process of education, and it's generations of education possibly behind it. People are taught to do these things, and there's different philosophical approaches to this question as well. Sort of what is a basic divide is kind of what is purposely and done with the realization that you want to do it, and what aspects of it are just part of our let's call it our cultural nature. There's French philosophers like Bourdieu who've called it habitus and things like that. So people who are studying philosophy and maybe archaeology more seriously have heard of this. But it has to do with how culture patterns our behavior, either behaviors that we realize or don't realize. So why are there just choppers in South China? Well, people have made technological arguments. Well, the raw materials were no good, so they couldn't make anything more complex. But had never tested it. So we tested this, and we collected raw materials from all over Hunan, where different types of Paleolithic sites are found, and we made tools with them, and we could actually make much more complex tools than choppers with them. We can make tools. The one term is le valois. I can't do it. Actually, to make a le valois tool takes, for a modern flint knapper, somebody who's just training themselves to make old tools, it takes them 2 years of daily practice to make a good le valois core and le valois flake. So Metenarin, who I showed you in the talk, he was the one who was making our stone tools, but he could use the raw material from Hunan and almost make a le valois core and flake with it. So raw materials weren't the problem at all. So the issue can often be cultural. It's just this is within the cultural range of what's acceptable. And chopsticks is in some ways an example of that too, or forks and knives in other cultures. Maybe one way is more efficient than the others, but it doesn't mean people are going to do it simply because it's not part of the cultural background. And there can be other reasons as well. But it's interesting you brought up that example. But we find this all universally in time periods and across world areas, that there are just different ways that people do things. And there can be a variety of reasons for this. The big issue is how we go about analyzing those differences. It's interesting to hear your approach, because you were talking about this for the pottery and then the choppers in your first two questions, and sort of applying the techniques that you use in your studies, where you break down complex processes into component parts. And then these can be, the component parts can be modeled in different ways and measured in different ways. And you can also combine these measurements or look at boundaries for these measurements. So when you're crossing from one stage to another, is there a certain maximum amount of something before the system changes? And in some ways, lithic specialists do that. There's all sorts of techniques that lithic specialists use, usually on looking at reduction sequences, but it involves all sorts of measurements of the length and widths and angles, and also looking at how the stone was handled and where it was flaked, and the angles in which things were removed, and the sequences in which things were removed too. This very complex type of work is what we apply to microblade industries in the north, because these are incredibly pre-planned types of tools that require many stages and steps in doing this. So that's really easy to tie into cognition and the development of cognition and language. The problem with the choppers is that it's 3 steps, 4 steps, and it's done. And it's just the same step. It's removing a flake. You just have to know there's a minimal angle that you have to hit the hammerstone on the core with, and you remove the flake. So how do we break that into attributes? Well, we can. The main issue, though, is actually in the approach itself. And in East Asia, especially in China, the approach is still what we call morphological typology. It's looking at the outward shapes of the core itself, usually, and then equating these shapes to kind of groups of people and cultures. And we're more interested behaviorally. How do we look at these stone tools? And are there other ways that we can examine them to see if there are what the decisions that are being made when the stone tool is produced, and then how's the stone tool used? And this is what can lead us to insights about behavior. And actually, it's a 3 million year old technology, like I said, but there could be indications that it's being used in different ways. And this is something that we're following up on in our research. And if we have a chance to go back and look at this material, we might find something there. The pottery was your first question, and this has to do with small and large, and how much a hunter-gatherer is willing to carry around with him or her. And it's an interesting question, and I can see kind of the desire to look for these cutoffs, sort of minimal cutoffs for maximal cutoffs for things, and drawing lines. In truth, for all of these types of behaviors, we're using terms that reflect huge ranges of behaviors. And for anything, you can find exceptions to the rule. And this is a problem that's more and more affecting even the I used behavioral modernity as a term in the Upper Paleolithic, which is marked by blades. But if you look far enough, you'll see that ornaments are used much earlier in a few places, and blades appear in some places well before the Upper Paleolithic. There's always these exceptions. Pottery is appearing before the Neolithic in more and more cases. And so the model itself, we have to, the trait list approach to these models isn't going to do us much help. And this becomes clear when we look at domestication, for example, because there's always a range of the earliest sedentary sites that we have, the Neolithic villages. They already have some domesticated type plants, for example. But we don't say the plants are domesticated yet. People are managing them and perhaps cultivating them to some extent, but it's not cultivating, not cultivating, domesticating, not domesticating. There's gradients. And to understand the entire process, you have to be able to appreciate that things grade from one to the next. So it's always a question of how much of one and how much of the other, and how these balances are changing. Pottery, to get back to the question, it's an interesting thing that you sort of think small things might appear first, and people would be willing to carry them around, and large things later. But the equating pottery with the Neolithic and sedentism had to do with the original thinking was that it isn't a portable material. And you'd be hard pressed to carry this stuff around with you anyway, even if it's small, because it's low fired, it's crumbly, it'll break and fall apart. Plus, we haven't found any examples of small pottery. It might not have any role or need until people are drinking more alcohol. Then we see a lot of cups in the archaeological record, especially in China. The story of the late Neolithic is one of drinking. That's another story to tell. But we have a parallel example, which is the grinding stones. I showed you grinding stones from Xianrendong. There's one from later levels, but our sites in North China from 28,000 years ago, they're using these big stone grinding stones, and they're mobile. So what do? You can't carry these things with you. You would get tired of that really, really quickly. So what you can do is, people were coming back to these sites over and over again. Maybe not every year, maybe not even every millennium, but they were coming back. And if they were coming back more often, you can leave materials at the site. No one else is going to come and take them. And when you're back there, when you're doing your kind of seasonal rounds, it could be there waiting for you again too. Yeah. So, but the other thing that I didn't mention is that part of the thing we have to consider for this early pottery is that there's so little of it. And this can be this can occur because of preservation, but it also might really reflect its very limited use. So why is there such a low density of pottery? If you wanted to apply, number of sherds per year, it's more like one sherd every 500 years is produced. Not even pot, one piece of a pot every 500 years or something by the counts. Yeah. Did I answer things okay?
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you both. So we are running out of time. So in the remaining several minutes, let's just pick the one question from the audience. So I prefer to pick Professor Ross Connor's question. Let me read for you. Dr. Cohen, I'm fascinated by the history of magnetic north or south pole reversal and its effects on plants and animals during various geological or archaeological epochs. I believe we are due for another reversal relatively soon that will force us to adjust again. In your research or micromorphology, do you see any evidence of this reversal in, say, the pottery, or the reason to seek shelter in caves, or the aforementioned gaps in activity or use of caves? I understand there might be increased UV rays to deal with, and caves afforded protection during different reasons of the year. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, and thank you for the interesting question. It brings up a lot of issues in dating and other things that archaeologists make use of. Of course, it's a very specialized field, paleomagnetic dating. A lot of people out there might not realize that if where you're pointing north today, if 1 million years ago, it would have been in the opposite direction. And this is because the magnetic poles of the Earth occasionally shift. And geologists learned about this and figured out which strata in the Earth's surface reflect those changes. And so world chronologies have been built on it, the major shifts in polarity. One of them is the Matsuyama-Brunhes shift, which is used in dating a lot of lower Paleolithic sites because it occurs earlier on in the Pleistocene. So in the later period, we don't have any of these complete polarity reversals that can be used. There are more localized shifts in magnetic north. And this is why if you're a cartographer or a hiker, you have to kind of calibrate your compass depending where you are on the Earth's surface and the date when your map was made and things like this. And this has been used for dating by archaeologists, where there are sediments where the iron particles in them will get locked in the direction they were facing at the time that they were deposited or fired. So pottery moves around, so it's hard to do that for the pottery, but when kilns start to be used, the kilns are often dated by paleomagnetism. So things later on in the Neolithic can be dated that way. River sediments themselves too can reflect the magnetic record of the Earth. So the iron particles, when flood deposits are laid down, if it's the right type of flood and sediments, they'll orient themselves generally in the direction of the magnetic field of the Earth too. And in a past life of mine, I was doing work on early Bronze Age materials, and we were doing searches for a rammed earth city wall of the early Shang dynasty. We actually located one of these walls, but one of the techniques you can use is magnetism, where you're looking for differences in the human constructed materials versus the naturally laid down materials. So naturally laid down materials have a higher magnetic field, let's call it, and the human ones where you disturb the orientation have a lower one. So a magnetometer can detect that difference, and you can identify where the man-made wall was within the flood deposits of the Yellow River. That was the case. So I've sort of generally answered the question. The caves as sites for protecting, whether it's UV light or anything else, yeah, that's a frequent argument for why people were living in caves. The other thing to realize is that the caves are often kind of nasty environments to live in. They're cold and they're wet and very damp. So if they are actually living in the caves, then adjustments have to be made. At Xianrendong, I mentioned they might not have actually been living in the cave. They might have just been dumping stuff in it. And people ethnographically and at archaeological sites like Natufian sites, which are a good parallel for this, they live on the terraces in front of the cave. So they have access to the cave when they need it, but the front of the cave is kind of a more pleasant place to live with exposure to sunlight and drier and stuff. So that could very well be going on at Xianrendong. At Yuchanyan, I mentioned that our big discovery there with the micromorphology is that all of the sediments are made by people burning stuff. So that was one of their adaptations to living in the cave. Plus they were cleaning and sweeping and mixing things around. If they were living on like grass beds, for example, could become infested with bugs. So they would burn those and then sweep those around and build more fires when they come back. So the caves were protective environments, but they also, you had to adapt to them in certain ways too. So there's very important cultural adaptations that are going on. They're also just an accident of the preservation and archaeological discovery too. People have disturbed the landscapes where the open air sites were, but the caves kind of protect the sites a bit more, perhaps.
Well, so thank you, Professor Cohen, for your very fascinating research and presentation, and thank you, Professor Chen, for your discussion. So for the remaining 3 questions, we will forward to Professor Cohen for his consideration and answer. So we will stop here. Time's up. Well, next, let's announce the events for next Thursday on December 9. So then we will invite Professor Pauline Grosjean from University of South Wales Business School to present her very interesting study on heroes and villains. It's about a long-term impact of a culture of heroism on autocratic value and the Nazi collaboration in France. So we look forward to see you on next Thursday. Thank you. Thank you again, Professor Cohen and Professor Chen. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chen. Thank you, David.